Okay. So last week we started talking about the Bell Confession, which in the Reformed Church we have 7 creeds and confessions. The 3 creeds that we have are what you call ecumenical creeds that are shared with the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, other Protestant denominations. And then the Reformed confessions are about 400 years old, and they really mark what it means to be a Protestant and Reformed Christian. So the Reformed Church in America, what does that mean? And so we share many of those confessions with like the Christian Reformed Church or the United Reformed Church and other specifically Reformed churches in the Reformed tradition. Even some Presbyterian churches hold to some of those documents. The Bell Confession was added in 2004, and it had been 400 years since the Reformed Church had added a confession. Think about that for a second. What would be at stake? What would have to be in this document for after 400 years to say, I think we're ready to add a 7th document? If you ever read the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, or the Belgic Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Canons of Dort, what you find is they don't really talk a lot about justice. They don't talk a lot about unity. They don't talk about reconciliation. They don't talk about compassion. They talk about what you believe about God, what you believe about Jesus. But they don't really talk about the life of Jesus. It's kind of interesting. Like if you ever read the Apostles' Creed, it like skips the life of Jesus. And the teachings of Jesus. If you ever read the Nicene Creed, it just skips the teachings of Jesus. It was more interested in who Jesus was and how he was connected to God. So the Bell Confession came along, and we'll talk more about it in a second, and then we're going to read part of it together because it's such a great document for worship. The Bell Confession talks about reconciliation. What do you do when your country's divided? What do you do if your church has different political opinions? What do you do if you're struggling to maintain unity? And the Bell Confession is about truth. It's about unity, it's about reconciliation, and it's about justice because it was born out of the apartheid in South Africa, which divided the church in South Africa. And the white church in particular, the white Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, upheld the apartheid separation, believing that that was something that God wanted in South Africa. And so the Bell Confession was a critique against the white church in South Africa and a call for unity. Man, I'm just giving away the whole end of my sermon right out of the intro. Okay, rein it back in, Pastor John, rein it back in. Okay, so we're going to go over a few different passages of the Bible that show us where justice and compassion really come from. And then we will come back to Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount and then the Bell Confession. So let's actually start with the reading of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew chapter 5. This was Jesus' foundational message. It was his campaign speech when he would go around starting this movement of love and reconciliation. It was one of his go-to talks. And so we'll start with that. Friends, the grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of the Lord stands forever. And I invite you to stand for the reading of Holy Scripture today. If you're new to the Bible, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we are in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." And I want you to highlight that one today. Kind of circle that one in your mind. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Go ahead and have a seat. So when Jesus gave this message, it was largely to a Jewish audience in northern Israel. And when he started giving this message, it brought up all kinds of things for Jewish people. Jesus didn't just make this stuff up. He didn't bring it out of nowhere. He actually was drawing from the ancient tradition of the Torah. So let's actually start in the book of Deuteronomy. I have a few verses for you today. So this is the book of Deuteronomy. This was written by Moses and given to the people shortly after they left Egypt. So they had been slaves for 400 years. They were free on the other side of the Red Sea, and they were trying to figure out what it meant to live. And so Deuteronomy was like this really long message that Moses gave the people on behalf of God. So these are the words of God through Moses. So it says, he, meaning God, defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. So if you read the Old Testament, you kind of get these big four that we are supposed to care for. You're supposed to care for the poor and the powerless. You're supposed to care for the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. Because for 400 years, the people of God were foreigners in Egypt, and they had their rights trampled on, they had their rights taken away, they were pushed down, they were a lower class, driven into slavery, and then they got out and became free. So you would think they would never want to do that. But God understands something about the human heart. There's something that happens to us when we get power. There's something that happens to us when we think we're right. There's something that happens to us when we think we're on the inside and other people are on the outside. And even though they had been slaves for 400 years, God can see it within them. He's like, do you think you're that different? Do you think you're that different than everybody else? That can get inside you too. That you can think you're better than other people, more deserving than other people. And so right in the heart of the Torah, right in the book of Deuteronomy is this charge. He, meaning God, defends the cause of the fatherless. God actually defends them and the widow. He loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. God loves the foreigner, the immigrants, the refugees residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. And I think it's really striking that he says to love. He says to love. He doesn't say anything about Republicans and Democrats. He doesn't say anything about policy. He doesn't say anything about what the government's position is and what the government's trying to do. He goes for your heart. That underneath the policy that you support, underneath the political party that you identify with, there's something deeper still. And it's love. You see, in your mind is where you have your opinions. Your mind is where you have your categories. It's where you have your judgments. It's where you make up the stories about the world. But beneath your mind is your heart. And God's interested in this. Do you feel like you're better than other people? Do you feel like you resent other people? Where does that come from? Why do you feel that way? Find it in here. Find the love. And let the love well up. And it can change your mind. And it can change the way that you actually see other people. So this wasn't something that Jesus just made up. It's in the heart of the Torah. So whether you're Jewish, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, this is the heart of the whole deal. Let's do another one. This is fun. Let's do another one. So this is from the book of Isaiah. So now Isaiah was one of the prophets hundreds of years later, hundreds of years after the book of Deuteronomy. So Isaiah is someone who's a prophet, and he is connected to power in Israel. And he says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And we talked about this last week, that prophets call people back to God. He called them back to the way that God actually wants us to live. So learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. So now we have Deuteronomy, we have Isaiah. Let's go to the Psalms, the worship book. This idea was put right into the songs that people sang at the temple. So this is the worship book, the song book of the people, where he says, how long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So this was put to music. They sang it together to remind themselves that if we really do believe in God, if we really are called to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, this is what love actually looks like. So then Jesus, 1,000 years later, sits up on a mountainside in northern Galilee, and he starts giving his interpretation of all of this. And one of the most beautiful things about the Beatitudes, what Jesus does, is if you read the Ten Commandments, it's a lot of thou shalt not, thou shalt, do this, don't do that. And even if you read the book of Deuteronomy, it's a lot of don't do this, but you should do that. It's almost about behavior, and it doesn't quite get to the heart of it, even though the passage that we read talks about love. So when Jesus comes to kind of give his interpretation, instead of giving a you should do this, don't do that, instead he gives a beautiful poetic picture of what the world would actually look like if we lived this way. So that's why Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So those who were like pushed down, pushed around, you're actually blessed. Not because things are going great for you in your life, but because your heart is actually aligned with God's heart. That's what it means to be blessed. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And if you ever see the word righteousness in the New Testament, you should circle it. Because when we hear the word righteousness, right, as like 21st century Christians, we think behavior, like abstaining from certain things, not doing certain things, but then doing other things. So if you think of a righteous person, typically you're thinking of someone who abstains from certain behavior. But in the Bible, you can translate that Greek word to righteous or to justice. Now let's read it one more time, but use the word justice instead of righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, who hunger and thirst for reconciliation, who hunger and thirst to see people whose rights have been taken away to get their rights back. Righteousness and justice are two sides of the same coin. The righteousness of God is the people of God living in shalom and in inclusion and in all the ways that God always hoped for us to live. That's righteousness when it comes to the Bible. For they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For you Beatles fans out there, maybe you've heard me reference this before, the Beatitudes, what we just read, is a lot closer to the song Imagine by John Lennon than it is the Ten Commandments. It's a vision of what the world could actually look like if we lived out of love instead of out of our opinions, our categories, and our judgment.